So our next panel is entitled Finding Our Roots. And so we thought it was really important to include this talk today. We've talked a lot about history, where we've come from as an organization, as a community. You heard a little bit about the evolution of how some of the therapies were developed in our condition. And we've heard from some of the experts and the work that they do. But we also thought it was important to include just sort of what that perspective looks like, both from two of the most incredible researchers and partners and clinicians in the cystinosis world. None of us would be here without them. Dr. Jess Thoene, Dr. Bill Gahl, our advocate and wise old woman, Marybeth Krummenacker. And then I'd also like to introduce Jean Campbell, who's been a great partner for us at CRN and for the rare disease community for a very long time. Worked with NORD several years ago, off on our own, doing amazing things in advocacy in rare disease. And so we are very lucky to have her here to moderate this panel. And with that, I'll leave it to Jean.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks, Christy. The thing about this panel is that when it was Marybeth's idea, as always, we started out 20 minutes. And then at that point, we're missing someone. We should have a chair for him. But we're missing our esteemed friend, Steve Groft, who, when we all loved and worked with him, he was the head of the Office of Rare Disease Research at the NIH. And he unfortunately injured himself, but he's fine. He's fine, he assures us. But it was going to be Marybeth and myself and Steve, and it was like, all right, and Christy said, you got 20 minutes. And then it went to, well, Steve goes, well, Jess is going to be there. We should ask Jess to be on the panel. All right, we'll ask Jess to be on the panel. We got 10 more minutes. And then Steve, who's not here and is the big idea guy, says, well, Bill's going to be there. We got to ask Bill. And I was like, oh my God, I'll never get them all to keep quiet or be contained in 20, 30 minutes. So we got an hour. So please bear with us. There is no need for introductions for these three. And so we're going to drop that. We're going to get right into it. We will talk for a little bit. There is nothing scripted here. This is not quite the Real Housewives of New York, but it's close. Okay? It's going to be close. But what I want to start us off with is recently Stat News did an article about the Duchenne community. And there's one thing about the rare disease community in general is that we share a lot of common threads. And the Duchenne community has worked very hard and has made amazing growth in their community. But there was an article that was recently done, and when I read it, I felt it was applicable. And there were 3 points that I'm going to start off with. And one was from a woman who said she wonders if the next generation will understand what they went through and what they did. The other one was, I know that the face of the advocacy community in which I work will likely change. And the third one was, though that progress has already been made, and as broadly and as improved standard of care has allowed many patients to live into adulthood, for them, knowing a next generation may face different odds is something that they have to all think about. So with that in mind, what I'm going to ask our panelists is to describe to you how they got, briefly, how they got into the cystinosis community. And that's where we're going to start the conversation from. So who wants to go first? Ladies first.
I'm not shy. 37 years ago, almost 38 years ago, it was funny, I was home and I was typing out thoughts, and I started out by typing, it was a cold February day when Laura Krummenacker entered the world, and I said, that's too harsh. It really wasn't. It was a bright, sunny day in February. It was cold, but it was a bright, sunny day. Laura was born in February. Her first year and she was almost 9 pounds, and her first year of life was uneventful. Let me back it up. I also have a son who's 3.5 years older than Laura, so as the pediatrician said to me at the end of the bed as I was being discharged with her, "You're a veteran. You know what you're doing. We won't worry about you." In other words, I knew what I was doing. I'm a second-time mom. So I did everything for her that I did for him. It never worked. We got through the first year, tried breastfeeding, a multitude of different formulas, but she gained weight despite all of that every month. So we were okay. We got the yearly shots. We did everything we were supposed to be doing. About age 2 is when the pediatrician said to me, I think she should be evaluated because she stopped. She was falling off the curve, the growth chart, and let's send you to a pediatric endocrinologist for a full workup. Okay, I go, I'm from Long Island. I have New York hospitals everywhere. Go to the local children's hospital. They did a workup at 2 years old. And what I didn't realize, what I didn't know, she was 15 months before she walked, terrible eater, all the classic signs of cystinosis. They came back and they said, "Oh, nothing showed up out of the ordinary. She's a failure to thrive baby." Okay, well then keep going, come back in 6 months for an evaluation. Went back in 6 months. She had grown a little bit, she had gained a little bit of weight, so they let me go another 6 months. I didn't question because I know what I'm doing. I was doing everything a mom was supposed to do for their toddler at that point, but she was tiny. She was tiny. I always said, though, Laura, that what God didn't give her in her size, He gave her in her mouth, because she started talking before she was a year old in complete sentences. So you always knew where she was, but... So at 3 years old, I was due to go back for a yearly evaluation, and she got sick. Her and my son both got a virus. She did not bounce back as quickly as he did after 2 days. I'm on the phone with the pediatrician at that point. This is going on, this is going... And never said, bring her in. It was 2 full days, never said bring her in. By the 3rd day when I brought her in, I laid her down on the table in his office. He looked at me and he said, "How did you let this happen?" I looked at him and had no idea. He had pinched the top of her hand and she was severely dehydrated. Take her to the emergency room. Didn't call an ambulance. You take her to the emergency room, which we immediately did. Got her into the examining room, and all I can remember at that point, because I had been up with her, I had to step out of the room because I couldn't deal with her, because they couldn't get a vein because she was so dry. They couldn't start an IV. And I remember at that hospital, which was not the first one we went to, that hospital, the head of pediatric emergency came over to me, and I'm in the hallway sobbing. She's inside screaming. Her dad was with her. And all I remember him saying to me, "Don't beat yourself up." He said, "We'll find out." So he recognized something. I don't ever know what it was. But this is what I do remember. And when they did admit her after they were able to draw blood, her potassium level was a 1.7. And I have been told, and these 2 gentlemen can verify it, how she wasn't having a heart attack or a stroke was remarkable. She wasn't, and I said to this day, it's because she's a fighter. And Laura is, so that was the beginning of our journey. That's where we met Dr. Frederick Haskell from New York, and he's the one who diagnosed her, and it took 8 months, and it started with, oh, there she is. Oh, you're not on the screen, Laura.
There it is.
I have to laugh. The picture in the middle, that's Easter there, with Laura's obviously in the middle. My son looked at her and she said, "You look like a lawn gnome." He wanted to push her down to My niece and my daughter are 1 year apart in that picture. And that's Laura. I can't look at that because I'll cry. So we started the journey, and it started, honestly, after Dr. Haskell follow-up. It was a phone call from Dr. Gahl and inviting us down to the NIH. And that truly, oh, Christy, there we are. and I'm going to say this, and Dr. Thoene, it's no offense, but I said Dr. Gahl and Dr. Gahl saved her life and saved mine. And it's been an extraordinary journey. And so she really had her first trip to the NIH when she was 3.5, and that was the beginning.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. Jess, do you want to?
I'm checking my watch.
Oh, all right, I'm going to give Jess a little throwback. This picture is when I first met Jess, and that's Nancy Harris in the middle, who was board chair of the National Organization for Rare Disorders, Abby Myers, co-founder of the NORD, and Jess, who was our original board chair, became head of the medical advisory board. So, Jess, I'm sorry, I had to throw this in.
That's fine, thank you. Well, I think most of us would agree that the root of CRN and you'll learn briefly of NORD is cysteamine. So, and Dr. Gahl was very kind yesterday. One of the slides he showed had the citation to the first paper in cystinosis, which was mine in Dr. Jerry Schneider's lab, who I would like to have 5 seconds of memory. He passed away. He's sorely missed by everybody that knew him. Bill and I and a couple of others wrote a memoriam that was published in the Molecular Genetics and Metabolism, if you'd like to read it. Back to a happier time, so I completed my training with Dr. Schneider, moved to the University of Michigan, and Bill and Jerry and I were doing a clinical trial, and we were getting the medicine, the human-use cysteamine, which was very rare and only produced by one chemical company in Switzerland. I got a letter the Christmas week of that year saying, "Dear Dr. Thoene, we're not making that anymore. Have a happy Christmas." And so here we are, early on in the clinical trial, 2 years, but the initial data were promising, and we were not going to have the drug. So I was sitting moping in my office, and I was reading Chem and Engineering News. I'm a card-carrying chemist, and there was a little black box at the bottom said, "Congressman Henry Waxman is holding hearings on the orphan drug." And I said, "Phyllis," my secretary, "get Congressman Waxman's office." She said, "How do I do that?" I said, "You're the secretary, figure it out." So it rang, and I actually then, many years later, was a Kennedy Fellow on Capitol Hill, so I know how these things work. You work up the chain of important people that you talk to. So first I talked to their general triage person, said, "I have a serious orphan drug issue that will affect the lives of many people." She said, "Oh, you need to talk to Bill Corr." Bill Corr was Congressman Waxman's specific aide for this issue, and I talked to him, and he said, "Yeah, why don't you come on down?" I said, "Well, can you pay my way to D.C.?" After he quit laughing, which was quite a while, I went to the vice president for research at the University of Michigan and said, "This is the status. I don't have money to fly to D.C. for this." He said, "That's university business. Go ahead." So that morning then, after bumbling around in D.C. as we all do the first time, I found the hearing room, and there was Congressman Waxman and the other subcommittee members, and Marjorie Guthrie. How many here besides me and the people here remember? Very few people. That's Arlo Guthrie's mother. But when this was happening, she was famous both as Woody Guthrie's wife and a member of the dance company. And she presented on Huntington's because he was in the last stages of a serious illness. And she was talking to the panel about problems they were having treating Huntington's disease. And so when I made my talk, I said, we don't have an eloquent and prominent spokesperson like Mrs. Guthrie, but our need is just as great. And I gave some slides of the disease, and then I said, in a very real sense, Mr. Waxman, the lives of these children are in your hands and those of this committee, and I quit. So in another half an hour, it broke up. I felt someone tug my shoulder. It was Mrs. Guthrie. She said, "You're not alone. We're all in this together." And that led then to a first meeting in Ann Arbor, which then became what became NORD. But I also need to say that someone else tugged my shoulder, and it was Ken Larson, a very, very close friend who had been CEO of several drug companies. Yep. And he said, "I think we can help you." I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, tell me a few details." in a letter, I got an Air Express, in a week, I got an Air Express letter from the company. We didn't really mean that. No, we're not. I never learned which buttons he could push, but he was very connected in a very, very polite way. And I use the past tense again, a good friend who passed away last fall. So that then allowed us to continue the trial, and which grew into finally FDA approval. And I think with that background, I can pass the baton to Bill.
Thanks, Jess. You just, between Ken Larson and Bill Core and Henry Waxman, that was a journey down memory lane for me. So thank you.
Oh, I forgot one thing.
Uh-oh.
As we joined, as NORD was forming and was said, I was first the president and then later the chairman of the board. But I said as we started meeting, we have several groups that are NORD is a coalition umbrella group for all rare disease groups that care to join. We didn't have one for cystinosis, which was my main interest, and I said, let's start a committee for rare diseases without organization. And that's where Marybeth came in, and then Cystinosis Research Network was formed, and she's represented that on NORD ever since.
Well, Jess was the champion and has continued to be the champion for cysteamine, and has been the mainstay for that for decades. So when there was a shortage of cysteamine, he went after getting phosphocysteamine and then getting a clinical trial to support it. And Dwayne Alexander, the head of NICHD at the time, basically funded this by telling his people to fund it when it wasn't really a clinical trial. It was just a way to get cysteamine to the patients, which it probably could get me fired to say that, but I had a different role. Jess saw a lot of patients. Jerry saw a lot of patients. I saw a hell of a lot of patients when I got to the NIH. But the beginning was, at least in my mind, was something that Jess doesn't even know, I think, and that is, I came from MIT to University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1972, do an MD PhD program. It wasn't combined at the time because Nixon had stopped funding for medical, for MD PhD programs at the time. So the head of McCardle Labs, which is the oncology lab there, named Henry P. Toe. And he said, well, why don't you come to my lab and get your PhD with me? So I did while I was doing my medical school in pediatrics. Anyway, his project for me was to find out what the basic defect was in cystinosis. He said, this could be a disulfide interchange enzyme deficiency. And so it was my job to figure out if that was possible. So I went and I looked in the literature, surveyed it all, found out that that study had already been done, and it had been done by Frank Tietz at the NIH. So I plopped the stuff on his desk, and I said, this has already been done. He says, okay, do polyamines. Just like that. So I got my PhD studying polyamine metabolism. Anyway, that was my introduction. And then when I had finished my chief residency in 1981 and was getting my PhD, I had applied to be essentially one of two of the first genetics fellows at the NIH. And so there was a lot of competition, maybe about 50 people were applying. One of the guys was going to get it because it was funded by the clinical center, and the head of the clinical center wanted him to work in his lab. But I interviewed with Liz Neufeld and Phil Leader and all those guys. And then I had to pick a lab. So I picked a laboratory of someone who was doing metabolism. It was Joe Schulman. His project was cystinosis. And he had a person there named Frank Tietz, who was a world expert in disulfides and free thiols, the sulfur stuff. And he was a spectacular guy who worked with us to find the basic defect in cystinosis. And within about a year, we knew what the basic defect was and published it in Science. So that allowed me to basically keep my job. And the other thing is that for some reason, all my bosses kept quitting. I'm just going to presume that wasn't me. But and then we saw patients as well. And we started to see a hell of a lot of patients because it doesn't cost anything to go to the NIH. And so I was seeing patients every 3 months. And by about 1985 or 86, I'd seen more patients than anyone in the world. That's how I got into it, and the rest is history. We started to write papers about all the patients we saw and discovered the late complications of the disease, and of course followed the treatment, et cetera. And Jess and Jerry were kind enough to let me take the lead in a publication in 1987, and so that's my history.
So what is a really great example here, and the preface to our talk today was this morning where you learned from the partnerships and the partnerships with industry and how that works and how we do that appropriately in the rare disease space. And a little shout out to my buddy Leslie King, who tried to steal some of this presentation, but it was also another walk down memory lane for me. I started in Nord in the early 90s, you know, when faxes were exciting. And you actually had to talk on the phone to people, which is how I evolved and got to know the rare disease space. But so there was understanding how you work with industry. We learned that when Denise was talking about the international component, that really is important because it's not just US anymore. It was a big deal to get Canada involved, right? And then it was, Europe, and Eurodis, European Organization for Rare Diseases, was developed, modeled on Nord, but has since grown immensely. So you can see that it just, and even it does take a village, and it does take cooperation, and it does take collaboration. And so here we have examples of working in a community that gets to know some of the science research people who, just met Marjorie Guthrie, who is well known for starting the Huntington's Disease Organization and been such a vibrant community leader. And from that, working with NIH and really navigating that. And the cystinosis community has done that. So when you come to a meeting like this, you go, wow, they put on a good meeting. But we're taking the curtain back because we want you to see what's involved with that. So now I'm going to throw out a couple of questions.
Jean, we have a few more comments.
Yes, he can, because he's Jess.
No, what Bill said jogged my memory a little. We all greatly enjoyed hearing Shay yesterday. No one has ever heard of the first patient who received cysteamine who had cystinosis. Yeah. And that was my patient. I was a fellow with Jerry Schneider. And she was the 6th child born to a family in Southern California with cystinosis. And since it was good renal transplant and good cysteamine, the first 5 died. And this girl was in renal failure. And I said to them, we have a potential drug that might help. Would you allow that? They said, sure, God's cursed our family and wants her to die. And they weren't laughing. They were quite serious. So this 9-year-old girl came to the ICU. And here's the interesting thing for any people in the audience younger than I am. I wanted to give intravenously to see if it lowered the white cell cysteine. And I was allowed to buy a bottle of cysteamine off the Sigma Aldrich shelf. I did sterilize it, and I put it in isotonic saline, and I injected it into her and then measured her white cell cysteine, and it plummeted. And so I went to Jerry. I said, look, this might work. So he said, okay, let's try it orally. So then with the same bottle, we started making pills and increasing the dose. Meantime, Ruth, that's her first name. I think HIPAA will allow me to say that. She used to come to this meeting. She's married now, so I'm getting to the end of the story. The drug caused seizures, which you heard about today, at a very high dose that we would never use now, and that's why we say don't use that, because in high concentrations, cysteamine can be seizurogenic. But that was easily taken care of, and I followed her as long as I was in Jerry's lab, and then she was followed there for many years. And she was too late to spare her native kidneys, but the rest of her did very well. And as I said, she's married and has had a good life. So hats off to you, Ruth. You weren't recognized at the time.
Thank you.
And then to tag team with Dr. Gahl, we went to the NIH. Our first trip was, I believe, September of 1989. So we, and one of the things, and you go down there and you're inpatient for 3 or 4 days, and you're running from test to test, because that's what you do when you're there, and you're carrying around, Carol, what are we carrying? We carried around our 24-hour urine collection, so we'd be running down the hallways with everything. And I remember coming home one time, and I remember opening the trunk of my car, and I think one of my neighbors was out there, and, "Oh, you're coming back from the NIH?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, there were cases of medicine." And I remember her saying to me, "You're so lucky you don't have to pay for that." And I stopped a minute, and I went, I'm lucky to have a child with a rare disease, so okay, I just let it go. But I remember her saying, "You're so lucky." But you know what? I am lucky, because look where we are. And I truly do feel blessed. And every journey has bumps in the road, but we're still here.
So, were there any particular instances during the cystinosis community's evolution that indicated that the inclusion of the patient family voice was key to their success?
Are they looking at me?
Can you think of anything? Where the voice, we all talk about the voice of the patient now, right? So where was it? And if anybody from the audience can think of that, was there a time when what your opinion was helped to keep you on the road to success, or the road to change, or a road to think about something different?
I personally, I think it was the fact that I met Dr. Gahl, and after that first visit, after I think the first day inpatient, when we told Laura's story and how I was supposed to be a veteran, know what I was doing, and I didn't realize how angry I was, because I was telling for 3 years the doctor what was wrong with her, and I felt dismissed. So I had built up a little bit of anger, and I took it out on him. And I remember it was terrible. And I said, I remember after that, I don't know what was said. I hope you don't remember. But I was just so angry, because I was frustrated, because there was something wrong. And I felt like nobody was listening to me until I met Bill Gahl. And we apologized. I mean, we went back, we found him, I think, in his office in the clinical center, and went back and apologized, because this was the person who was going to finally help us. But you listened, and I think that was the key. I finally found somebody who was going to listen, and I think that was my first experience.
I think one of them is when Gene Holtz actually formed the Cystinosis Foundation. I think that was probably one of the pivotal things, and also because Jean in her younger years was also part of that community with Marjorie Guthrie and Abby Myers, and people from the Wilson's disease and Parkinson, which was considered rare back in those days, all came together to bring this community together. So I think of that as the need of getting a voice out there, getting some recognition is pivotal. And that it was pivotal when CRN was, because they saw the need to do other outreach, to additional outreach, and not just with international, but to address the needs of the community that they knew, and how do we make their journey a little bit easier. So, yeah?
I'll just give an anecdote about that as well. But first, I should say that when people get mad at me, I just let it come off my shoulders like that. I've been married for 50 years. But the anecdote is this, that the Hammonds were very close to Tip O'Neill. Mm-hmm. And Senator Ted Kennedy came to visit the NIH. He was close to the director of the NIH too, Dwayne Alexander, and the family. Anyway, they came and they saw cystinosis patients with me a long time ago. And maybe we can't really put a concrete result on that. But when you have a senator with that much influence coming to the NIH, I am quite certain it influences how much the NICHD would support it, the cystinosis, and that was family generated.
Yeah. You never know, right? You never know what a little connection can do, and that's part of the story. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Kevin, my son, and I came to NIH to be lobbyists, and Ted Kennedy, we were in the room, sitting on a bed in a room with him and all these press people, and I think Donna Shalala, who was the House Human Health, anyway. So that was something that we got to do to help. But what helped us so much too was learning from, at NIH, the cystinosis patients who were there and the parents that were a little bit older than we were at the time, whose children had been diagnosed and they had been taking the drug, and we could call them. They had volunteered themselves to let anybody new coming in to call them, and that's where this networking started, and this helping each other get through this and learning what to do to be effective for our children. And Dr. Gahl was always so supportive, always. And all the parents that, we were allowed to talk to would help. And we got through it and made it to a greater, efficacy of treatments for all the kids.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you for sharing all of that. Yes.
This could never have happened today, but when Dr. Gahl called me and he asked me, I'm from Long Island, he said, I have another patient on Long Island. I think you can call them. And you gave me Michelle Bearline's phone number. Now, because of HIPAA, you cannot do that today. You can't. But you did, and my conversation with Michelle Bearline was the first conversation I had with a mom. And that was what drove me.
All right, it wasn't the rule then.
He didn't break any rules.
No, he did not.
Just get it straight.
But when I think back to 34 years ago, you could not have done that today because of HIPAA. So as wonderful as that is sometimes.
Jean, we have another comment in the back of the room.
When our granddaughter was born, and for 6 months she did fine, and after that she kept going downhill like all the other children. We would go to the doctors, and by 9 months they were telling us, take her home, keep her comfortable, and let her die. Twice. The third time, we were at University of Iowa Hospital, and she was 11 months old, and this doctor had been out at NIH, and they were releasing us to take her home again and just keep her comfortable. This doctor came in and said he had just been out at NIH, and this was in 1985, and he said, let me look at her eyes, and he did, and he found the crystals. And within 5 days, we were out at NIH and diagnosed and started on the medications, and she's 38 years old.
The power of connections. The power of connections here is what makes for a successful patient advocacy organization, and their willingness to listen and learn from other entities that could better the overall community. Now, this may be one of my dumb questions. So what therapy was a game changer for the cystinosis community? Come on.
Cystagon? That was the beginning? That was in 1996? 94. Okay, I'm off by a couple of years.
Okay.
Because
Take that away
we
from her.
would have to go to the NIH every 4 months, and we'd get our supply of god-awful smelling medicine and bring it home. And that's the only way we could get the medicine. There was no drug. And then when they got FDA approval, and instead of a packet that we had to dilute in distilled water, Mylan Pharmaceuticals, they were capsules. So I said, "Whoa, this is going to be easy." Little did I realize, it was a game changer.
Mm-hmm.
Those capsules. That for me, that was the first.
Jess has a comment.
Well, continuing an in-depth history of the development of cysteamine, when I had that data and I mentioned Ken Larson, He said, "Do you have anybody to make it?" I said, "No." He said, "Let me talk to a friend of mine who happened to be Mike Pushkar, who owned Mylan Pharmaceuticals." And they flew out, and I presented my data. And in 2 weeks, I got this most exciting call saying, "How do we license that from the University of Michigan?" And the reason they said that was I had given them some other data against HIV, which happily coalesced, and I had the patent through the University of Michigan to use cysteamine for AIDS. And that got the company quite excited. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, this other small disease, yeah, we'll do that too." So that's how we got it. It was a large generic. Now it's a very large company in Belgium. But Mylan Pharmaceuticals made the initial commitment and pushed it through. The document I wrote to FDA for an IND, an investigational drug number, was 1 page. And Mylan had to rent a 5-ton truck to take the documents to FDA. Dr. Gahl and I went and had an interview with FDA, and which was sort of stringent, but as long as I'm talking, you can correct me, Bill. We presented our data, and then they said, "Well, what about these patients here?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, we included everybody. You did intent to treat?" I said, "Well, yeah," and maybe Bill will add to that. But that's how we got FDA approved.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you a question of basically how long it was between the time that Mylan got on board and the time that we had the FDA meeting, which was July of 1994, because the approvals of drugs do not happen that fast anymore under any circumstances. But indeed, the meeting was in July with the FDA of 94, and Robert Temple was the branch chief for the Food and Drug Administration. And we went through some stuff, and then Temple says, "Well, tell me about the Markello paper." And the Markello paper was the important intent to treat paper because Tom Markello, who was in my lab, took every patient ever seen at the National Institutes of Health and divided them between 1962 and 1992, and divided them up into those that had really good cysteamine therapy, no cysteamine therapy, and intermediate. And then he examined the 24-hour urines for their creatinine clearance, which is a measure of kidney function, and he plotted, as a function of time, the kidney function. And for the ones who were treated well, it's basically stayed up and went down only a little bit. For the ones who got nothing, it went right down. And for the ones in the intermediate, it went in between. And the statistician type folks that the FDA are were incredibly impressed with intent to treat, as you said, because every single patient who had cystinosis was included in that study. And that doesn't happen very often.
No.
And as an aside, that paper, and Laura was, her kidney function, she was plotted to lose her kidneys at age 13, and she did.
Oh.
You don't remember the time that Mylan first picked up on this, or do you?
Oh, they're getting into the weeds.
In my mind, with HIV, the 2 things were happening concurrently.
So there's some great little nuggets of history here. And you can see the dedication, how long it really took to get this to happen. And the cystinosis community was there all along. And I remember first meeting up with the cystinosis community, first with Jean Holtz, and then later with the Hammonds and with Christy and with Marybeth, and getting to know them in my work at Nord and then after I left. So that community is really important, and it takes several people behind that wizard's curtain to pull this off. So I know that it might seem, wow, we have 4 treatments. How unusual is that in the rare space? I know it's rare, but you know.
What % of rare diseases have 1 treatment?
Well,
I think that emphasizes.
Yeah, I think what Jess said is right. There are huge numbers of diseases that have no treatment at all.
90%.
Yeah, like 90%, and it's not as if they aren't even working on them. Is really the issue.
Yeah.
So we're incredibly lucky, and the reason is because of this advocacy community, and because of partnerships, including partnerships with industry. So I'll just give this anecdote about the eye drops. You know, a lot of the work on the eye drops was done at the National Eye Institute with patients that came there to get the oral treatment. So we knew the natural history of the eye drops by virtue of having seen hundreds of patients with cystinosis over the years. But when the NEI, or when I, at the NIH, collect data, we collect it as academicians, like on spreadsheets, like we write the stuff down, etc. It's not ready for the FDA. But Sigma Tau Pharmaceuticals at the time, which is now Lediant, picked that stuff up and spent, I think, about 12 years, because they started in 1995. No, it's a little more than that. And it wasn't approved, I think, until 2012. So they spent a long time trying to put all of this, let's say, I would say good data, but in terrible form, into the right format for the FDA. That was a huge commitment, millions of dollars for that. So industry's really important for that too.
Are you going to add anything? No? Okay. I'm just checking. You know, you're being really good, you guys. I'm really impressed. So how has the community, and this could be to anybody, not just to the group here, how has the cystinosis community assisted in research? How has the cystinosis community assisted in forwarding research?
By showing up, number one.
Okay, by showing
by
up.
being there.
By showing up, by raising the funds. Do you know how many suckers I sold? We used to have a fundraiser and with a high school in our community, and that's how we got the money for Galena to come on to the NIH. It was high school kids, and
Buying suckers?
buying suckers. It was
Wow.
$1. It was the hardest $100,000 I've ever raised in my life, but we raised it in a week. High school kids, and it was getting their passion behind my passion. And then we were in every, Laura was in every research study from the time she was diagnosed until a week before her death. She was at Montefiore doing a research. We believed in research, and we knew, my saying with her birth was, I could do cystinosis if I knew the child that came behind her would not have the same course. And I think we all felt that way. And we all volunteered, we all showed up, and it was not always pretty. It was sometimes some icky studies, and they were hard sometimes, but we did them because we knew it was going to make a difference. And we knew we were partnered. And that was something that I appreciate with the physicians, that they gave us that power of partnership in the treatment and in the direction that cystinosis research went. They gave us that power and the input to help direct as well.
I think it was and you have to recognize the opportunities, and we've had so many blessings and opportunities in this community because of the doctors that are on either side of me. But I'll never forget signing the waiver to put her on phosphocysteamine, sitting on the 9th floor of the clinical center by myself. There was nobody there but me. And I remembered having the pen in my hand, signing that authorization, and I didn't know if the medication was going to kill her or not. But I knew I had no choice. And I trusted who was advising me, and I trusted this is an opportunity and we have to do it. And signed it, and there she is.
I'll again add a little history to that. The phosphocysteamine came online because I had a contact at Walter Reed Army Hospital who said, and sent me 3 books that thick full of data. Our pilots that fly at high altitudes, now this is a long time ago, but like 70,000 feet, have to take something to protect them from solar radiation, and cysteamine makes them throw up in their face mask, so that's not good. But we have phosphocysteamine, which is better. And I said, well, how do I get that? He said, well, I don't know. And I had a neighbor who was the head chemist for Park Davis at the time. He said, you need to call Maximilian von Strontman. And I called him, and he said, yeah, I make it in my garage. But it's FDA approved. So I got it, and to answer Marybeth, I got the bulk, and then Jerry, I think in his lab, and maybe Adam Jonas, packaged it into little foil packets. Before anybody got it, I took some. I got my blood pressure cuff and my best technician, and I sat in my office and I drank some. I thought, okay, I survived, we can try it.
Jean,
That is scientific study.
we have another comment from the audience.
Well, first of all, I want to say that you guys were a godsend to us from the first day that we came to the NIH. I remember Dr. Schneider. He was the most down-to-earth, really easy to talk to, and he understood our pain. But after our son passed away, then our daughter, it took 9 months to get diagnosed. My son was never diagnosed. And we found this great doctor finally after, from 9 months to 18 months when she finally got diagnosed. And the second visit to our nephrologist, they mentioned that there was a treatment for cysteamine. And my daughter was put on that, and we saw the improvement right away. But we were so desperate in all those times that we were trying to get it diagnosed. After that happened to us, that our son passed away, that we started doing fundraising. We started to do something. We wanted to do something. And I don't know if Dr. Gahl remembers our first conference. We came to Washington. My husband, my late husband, he brought a check with him that we had done a fundraiser, and he came on stage. And I said, no, you can't do that. So he came on stage, and he tried to give you a check. I don't know if you remember.
Well, someone can try again if they'd like.
And Dr. Gahl said, no, I can't take that. We don't take money.
I'm not Clarence Thomas.
Do you remember that?
You know, now that you mentioned, I do remember it.
But then we got affiliated with California, with Gene Holtz, and, we started fundraising and send the money to them. But it was so funny because we didn't know what to do. We didn't know where to go. And he said, okay, I have this money. I'm going to give it to him so he could do something.
He looks like an honest guy, right? Yeah, that's true.
I'll just mention one other example of that. And the community allowed us to do muscle biopsies when we were looking for carnitine deficiency in the muscle. And it reminded me today, or yesterday, when one of our patients who's a little bit older now had shorts on, because I saw the scar. And I thought, this is a big deal to get a muscle biopsy for that research. The community's been incredibly responsive to us. So thank you.
I also, and Christy, Denise, you talked about this in your CAB, your advisory boards. And being on advisory boards, industry they have listening sessions, they have advisory boards, they have standing patient councils. The CRN is involved in those types of activities.
Yeah, so Denise brought that up this morning, and so we have the honor to serve on that community advisory board that Cystinosis Network Europe was so instrumental in developing. And it's a way that our industry partners and other academic researchers can come to the community and get perspectives from people living with the disorder or caregivers with the disorder on the work that they're doing, and get from people who understand how to look at a clinical trial, how to give input into how convenient is this that we show up for this many visits and stay this many hours and that sort of thing and undergo this many tests, or packaging. Leslie had mentioned that we had helped them with a bottle feasibility study, and so coming to patient groups to really talk directly to patients and advocates and get that input on how to design and execute clinical trials, and then when you're ready to launch a product on the market is really vital, not only for this success from the company's perspective for a product, but for more importantly for our success and how we're able to contribute to these studies and how we're able to use those medications.
So, and that's really good example because it has progressed. The ability to bring in what you have to say, what you want to share, and even if you want to share something that's not so terrific, but you can share it with those that are either developing a treatment or doing research. And that's why, when Horizon mentioned one of their programs, they used to be called meetups, but now they're called other things. Regionally is bringing people together with the same disease to sort of talk about, because some people sometimes don't belong to an organization, or they don't belong to a Facebook page, but they're outliers. So it's trying to get the voice of everybody, so that as a community, you can assist by participating. So if you hear of any of those opportunities, I would encourage you to participate in those. So why should an individual, we're talking a little bit about clinical trials and being part of a clinical trial. So why should somebody sign up for a clinical trial? Why?
Do you want to take this?
Bill and I can speak to that point very directly, as can all of you who've participated. There's no increase in knowledge unless we're ultimately able to do human trials. And that rests on the conscience of all of us. It has to be safe, it has to be well designed so that the data collected means something. But without volunteers from whatever specific disease community the investigator wants to study, there will be no study, there will be no advancement in knowledge, and then there will be no therapies.
Pam Woodward, who was one of our former board members who passed away this past December, used to very easily simplify it for me. If you don't have the patient, you don't have the research, you don't have the medicine. You have to figure out how to work that all in, how to advocate for each other, how to communicate with each other, or you have nothing. So meetings like this are hopefully to give everyone in this room the tools to take it home and start advocating. And then, you know what? There's opportunity to join us on any level. And that's what I think we're here to really encourage you. But you don't have the family, you don't have the research, and you don't have the medicine. So that's pretty clear to me.
So we have about 7 minutes left? Okay. So has any cystinosis research been helpful in other rare diseases? And I'm just throwing out there, I don't know.
Well,
Non-rare diseases, it may help.
Okay. And that's not unusual, right, Jess?
That's what,
It's not unusual to help in non-rare.
if we learn something, it may have, as I like to teach my students, biology is one. Something that happens in us is going to be reflected somewhere else. And as I said 2 days ago or 1 day ago, it includes viruses. Hopefully it's harming the virus and helping our patient. But there's a unitary structure in biology, and I would like all of you to remember that, and to, as you read the paper, one, be careful the source you're reading so you aren't reading garbage, because there's a lot out there. But two, you can see, at least without knowing the gritty details, that if it works somewhere, there's going to be something related to that. And if not, it's a standout phenomenon that teaches us other things about how a given organism did that problem differently. Sort of like the eye in the octopus. The eye has evolved several times throughout nature, but the octopus has a really neat eye that's not like ours, but it works very well.
so I'll give one research example and one clinical example. Cystinosis was the first disorder associated with a defect in transport out of the lysosome of a small molecule. The second, though, was SALA disease, or infantile free sialic acid storage disease, in which the compound that's stored is sialic acid, a charged sugar. And we now know that it's stored there because of a transport defect, in pretty complete analogy to the defect in cystinosis. So there's cystinosin is the protein for transporting cystine, and silin is the protein for transporting silin. And we're actually now studying sialic acid storage disorders in our laboratory and have a consortium around the world to do that. But the point is that that disorder was discovered because of the precedent that was set by cystinosis. And then clinically, people are now studying cysteamine for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. So there is some application.
That's good to know. So before I ask Jess and Marybeth and Bill to give a little parting pearls of wisdom, going back to that STAT article that I read from the Duchenne community, one of their final paragraphs was, now this was interviewing mostly 3 women who were pioneers in growing the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy and other related organizations. And Jim McNary quoted by saying that some of the legacy parents are ready to hand off the baton to the next generation of parents and individuals, adults living with the disease. And the next fight will take new, less exhausted people. And I thought that was so telling and so shared by so many individuals that I know in this rare disease community, that a lot of the organizations are reaching that milestone of 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 in TASACs. And some of them want to retire to Boca. You know, they want to get ready, and they're ready to pass the baton. So part of the reason that we did this panel was to give you some of the back history of where the cystinosis community was, to show how vibrant they were throughout these 20 years of engaging with whoever they thought was important to engage with, and maybe just to listen to. And I just want to congratulate you. My first cystinosis meeting was down in Georgia, and I got to see so many of the young families. They're young adults now, and it's been interesting. You're one of the most uniquest communities to have that transition from pediatric to adulthood. That really is incredible, and it's so admired by so many people. So I would encourage you to keep up the good work and to become involved and to find a way to give back to this organization and to the community who has done an incredible amount of work for all of you throughout the 20 years and beyond. So, with that, what pearls of wisdom do you have to impart to the cystinosis community? It's not that tough, Bill.
Want to lead us?
I want to go last.
Okay.
I want to go last.
Marybeth's going first.
I'm trying to think of some witty old Irish saying, and I can't. Just to echo what Jean said, it's not easy. I mean, I worked full time in a job for 26 years. I have a son. I was a single parent, and I did it. It takes a lot of work. It takes a commitment. But there's always somebody there to answer a question, and don't be afraid to ask a question. That's one of my biggest things. If I had a question for Dr. Gahl, I'd email him and I'd get an answer. And respect. That's the other thing. Respect people in their positions. One of the things I do not like is sometimes social media, when things are put out there that I know are not true, and I hesitate and I won't put things on there because it just starts a debate, and I don't want to get in the mud because I just don't like that. So if anybody in this room ever has a question about anything, CRN, cystinosis, young adult, email us privately. It doesn't have to be a debate in a public forum, from my perspective. I think a phone call or a private email is a much better, healthier way to go. And if I could leave with any pearls of wisdom is just ask. You'll get an answer. Who's next?
I'll let you be last. So, my son was captain of the John Berry, a destroyer in the South China Sea. And when I talked to him afterwards, he told me this one pearl, and I want to relate it to this. He said, you know, some of our guys just don't want to lose. They're trying not to lose. They're not trying to win. We have to win. And winning means taking chances and being willing to fail. All of us up here and all of us in the room are failures in so many parts of our lives. And learning to fail and accept that and getting back up and doing something that's really valuable is maybe the most important lesson for me to teach my children and grandchildren. So let's all be willing to fail so that we can succeed, because that's the only way, in other words, by trying.
Well, I actually can't add anything to what they've both said. It's absolutely true, and it's absolutely good guidance for life. And though I would like to give you a profound pearl, I'd rather end with a semi-joke, which is the 2 verses from a Western song. Soap your own saddle, brand your own cattle, and some of your neighbors as well.
I think a perfect way
Thank
to
you
end.
very much.